In 2012, Ridley Scott came out with his alien prequel movie, Prometheus. I saw it in theaters with some of my friends, and we were treated to a movie that was unlike anything else in the series before it. It reached new heights of horror and mind-screwiness that left us all with one big question. Ridley Scott, what the fuck is wrong with you? It's now 5 years later, and the newest Alien movie has been released, Alien Covenant, and I find myself asking that very same question. Ridley Scott, what the fuck is wrong with you? Now, I'm going to forego my usual review style for this movie. If you're an Alien fan, you're most likely going to see this movie, and if you're not, this isn't going to be the film to change your mind. Instead, I want to talk about some of the decisions made in this film, and why I disagree with them. I've had some time to settle and arrange my thoughts, and I've spoken to others who've seen this movie too, and we all came to the same conclusions. Alien Covenant is a passable Alien movie, but considering where Prometheus left off, it left me feeling empty, wanting answers, just like Elizabeth did when she and David took off at the end of the movie. Now, don't get me wrong, I had been looking forward to this movie since it was first announced. Say what you will about Prometheus and its problems, but the film did end with an interesting premise. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, played by Noomi Rapace, and David, the android played by Michael Fassbender, had just acquired an engineer ship and were on their way to find the engineer's homeworld to learn more about them and find out why they're so eager to kill their own creation, us. No matter what they learned, it seemed the answers were poised to take us into interesting new directions in the cinematic universe of Scott's. Except we were never given that chance. Spoilers. In Alien Covenant, the crew of the Covenant, the eponymous colony ship, find a world remarkably like Earth and decide to investigate. After a run-in with some familiar-looking creatures, the landing party is saved by the android David. After some exposition, we learn that Elizabeth and David never met the engineers. Instead, David basically carpet-bombed them to death with bombs containing the black liquid from Prometheus. On top of that, we find Elizabeth dead in David's shelter/lab. Her body basically opened up like a flower. All of the build-up from the previous movie's ending had come to naught. With that reveal, my interest, and I imagine the interest of a lot of moviegoers, had all but disappeared. Now, in horror movies, including the Alien films, often the scariest things aren't what you see, but what you don't see. Well, in Covenant, there's a lot we see, but what I didn't see was the story. Yeah, there was the stuff involving the Covenant, David creating the Xenomorphs, more on that later, and all of that, but a lot of the important stuff was left unseen. We learned after the fact that David had decided to engineer what he believed to be the perfect organism. We see him bomb the engineers, and we see Elizabeth's fate, but we never really learn about is what led up to that. In the scenes we did see, which were primarily in a prologue video posted online, Elizabeth and David ended up bonding and growing close during their voyage, with Elizabeth even rebuilding David's android body. David, throughout Covenant, professes to loving Elizabeth, but the obvious question here has to be asked. David, if you loved her so much, why the hell did you go completely against anything she wanted? And that's the problem. We never learn just what his motivation is or why it is. Elizabeth wanted to meet the engineers and talk to them, and that's a pretty far cry from bombing them to oblivion. All throughout the movie, I was hoping to see her reaction and response to David's actions, but we never see it. We also never see what leads to her death and experimentation. It's implied David kills her, but we never see how or why. Speaking of David's experimentations, we see that he's trying to create his idea of the perfect organism, but we never see just what leads him to believe the perfect organism is a wild, violent killing machine. Nor do we see just what leads him to create the egg facehugger system. Now, one of the plot points that's touched upon in Covenant is that androids are unable to create. David may be the exception to that rule, fine, but creation usually involves some sort of inspiration. So what did he see that leads into this unique perspective. This leads me to one of my biggest issues with Covenant. The whole idea that David himself single-handedly creates the Xenomorph race. This goes completely against what we see in previous movies. For example, in Alien, the original Alien, one of the most famous scenes in the movie is when the crew of the Nostromo find the wrecked alien ship, which we now know to be an engineer vessel. Inside the ship is, of course, a bunch of Xenomorph eggs. Now, if David had created the race just a few years prior to Alien, by the series timeline, then why and how does an engineer ship obtain a bunch of eggs and crash, sitting there for what seems like decades, if not centuries? It's implied in that film that Xenomorphs had been around far longer than Covenant says. Now, you might be thinking that they're changing this for the Prometheus series, but even in Prometheus they come across this carving of a Xenomorph in the ship where they first discover the black liquid. Again, Xenomorphs had already existed. Saying that David had just created them, it makes no sense. Thing is, this would actually have been easy to fix though. Let us see more of Elizabeth and David's journey. Let us see them find the engineer's planet. Maybe give us some sort of interaction with them before David decides to exterminate them. Heck, maybe have them check out one of their buildings and find a diagram of a Xenomorph. Have him look at it and, nod his head or something, Let us see the line that leads us to where we are in Covenant, because, as it stands, it's far too disjointed to follow. Speaking of not being able to see things, one of the movie's biggest twists happens at the very end. After Daniels and Tennessee, our main protagonists for this film, manage to save the ship from one last Xenomorph, they decide to go back to cryosleep. As Daniels is about to go under, he asks David, who she believes is Walter, the android from her ship, if he'd help her build a cabin on a lake, in a callback to an earlier scene between them. Walter shows absolutely no recognition, which tips Daniels off that it's really David, and all she can do is panic as cryosleep overtakes her, leaving her fate ambiguous and leaving David in charge of the Covenant and all of the colonists sleeping on board. The problem with this twist, however, is what it follows. Back on the planet, Walter tries to stop David, and the two have a fight. In this fight, we see that Walter is clearly the stronger model. He has a lot more abilities, including regeneration abilities, surviving David's attempts to stab him. At the end, Walter has David pinned down and is about to smash him with a rock as we see David reach for a knife on the ground. Later, we see an android with one hand, Walter having lost his in an encounter with one of the aliens, sacrificing it to save Daniels, rejoin Daniels on board their escape ship. Now, as stated, this is implied to be Walter, having won his battle with David. And from what we see in the movie, he should have won. That should be Walter there. Not just from Daniels' point of view, mind you, but from the point of view of the audience who watched the previous fight. David was purely outclassed. Even if he did grab the knife and stab Walter, it had already been shown that it wouldn't have done anything. He'd already been stabbed once, and he survived just fine. So how was David able to incapacitate Walter and take his place on board the ship? This is something else that, quite honestly, needed to be addressed and shown at some point. Without some sort of explanation, this little switch makes absolutely no sense given what we're shown. Now, it's possible that some of these scenes might be shown as deleted scenes on the DVD or Blu-ray. Or, I know they're supposed to be working on a film, I guess, that's supposed to take place between Prometheus and Alien Covenant. But as it stands, right now they merely point out the plot holes, confusion, and frustration. You know, when I first sat down to talk about this movie, and when I first wrote down my notes on what I wanted to talk about, I was fully prepared to lay the blame at David's feet for screwing everything up. And as a character, this isn't wrong. It is his fault in the story. But deep down, the real fault lies with Ridley Scott and the others behind the creation of this film. They took a good premise, seemingly abandoned it for reasons I can't fathom, and gave us a film that just felt incomplete. One of the first things you're taught in any kind of writing or acting class is Show, don't tell. And that fundamental rule was broken on numerous occasions here, and as a result, the movie fails to deliver on any kind of satisfactory note. As Covenant comes to a close, we see David preparing to continue his plans for the Xenomorphs, now with a ship of 2,000 colonists to play with. But the question is, concerning everything that's happened, do I, and does the audience even still care? I don't know. For the Mathiason Project, this is Thor Mathiason, signing out.